Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Charlie, for organising the webinar. Hello to all of the people joining the webinar from around the world. I'm joining you this morning, Tuesday, from Australia. As a researcher in international law and human rights, I'm obviously observing the conflict in Ukraine with interest and concern. And one thing that connected me to Charlie and the Human Security Lab's work was my notice early in the coverage of the war that there was very little mention of the travel ban that had been imposed on men aged 18 to 60 and the consequences of that policy. It's certainly challenging to find space for discussion of human rights issues within Ukraine while it's engaged in a war of self-defence. And so I'd like to start by commending the Human Security Lab for maintaining its focus on the human rights of civilians, including men and their families, in the context of this travel ban. And I began to write online about the ban in March this year, and I've since heard from several men in Ukraine, as well as the partners and friends of men who are trapped in Ukraine. And to connect with the data Charlie has just presented, I'd just like to share, first of all, two sample comments from my correspondence. The first is here. So according to this one man, he said he was facing a choice between separating from his family to enable them to flee a war zone or staying together, but fearing his forced mobilisation. As a citizen trapped in the war, he was agreeing with the human rights arguments against the travel ban, and said it's a great shame that the Ukrainian government resorted to restricting the human rights of his citizens in order to afford itself a marginal defence benefit in this war. And a great number of civilian lives might be lost by reference to the sorts of concepts that were being used to justify the ban. And this correspondent noted the contrast between the considerable efforts of neighbouring countries to support Ukrainian refugees and the fact that his own government wasn't letting a certain proportion of the population flee the war. Jenna, could you go to the next slide, please? Here's a report from another man I've been corresponding with. This person is in hiding to avoid mobilisation. He said it's incredibly frightening to realise that I'll need to fight or die on the battlefield. I've never taken weapons. He's afraid of being mobilised and he wants to survive and leave the country, but feels embarrassed because men who try to leave are called traitors or cowards. But I believe that the right to life is a basic right of every human and no one can steal it. I have even thought about illegal border crossing, but this is risky and I don't want to commit a crime. Now, I acknowledge that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal and that Ukraine is exercising its right to defend itself against Russia's aggression. But I remain concerned about Ukraine's human rights practice because states retain their human rights and add humanitarian law obligations during conflict. Also, with Ukraine seeking to hold Russia accountable in legal tribunals for its aggressive conduct, it's very important for Ukraine to promote adherence to international law through its own practice. So with that context in mind, what are some key human rights issues arising from the travel ban? My colleague Lee will soon focus particularly on conscientious objection. So I'll just briefly now focus on a few other issues, particularly freedom of movement, the rights of children, and some humanitarian law considerations. So first of all, in terms of freedom of movement, as you can see here on the slide, this right is protected by Article 12 of the ICCPR. That's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, one of the two core foundational human rights treaties in international law. And the right includes the right to leave a person's country. So obviously the travel ban restricts this right to freedom of movement for those who are subject to it. Next slide, please, Jenna. One thing I wanted to draw out this morning or this evening is the rules or the ways in which international law looks at derogation from human rights. So as you can see under Article 4 of the ICCPR, it's possible for countries to take measures that derogate from some of their obligations under the Covenant. and this includes the right to freedom of movement in time of public emergency, which threatens the life of the nation and the existence of which is officially proclaimed. Such measures may only be taken to the extent strictly required by the situation, and provided that those measures are not inconsistent with a state's other obligations under international law, and also that they don't involve discrimination solely on the grounds of, and these include race, colour, sex, language, religion, or social origin. And adding to that, there are these Syracuse principles. It's a non-binding but guiding statement of international law. They're the principles on the limitation and derogation provisions in the ICCPR, and they provide some additional guidance regarding legitimate derogations from rights obligations. So, for example, from paragraph 51 of these principles, the severity, duration and geographic scope of any derogation measure shall be such only as are strictly necessary to deal with the threat of the life of the nation and are proportionate to its nature and extent. And under paragraph 64 of those principles, the derogating state shall have the burden of justifying its actions under law. And Charlie briefly referred to this already today. In March this year, Ukraine lodged notice with the UN Secretary General of its derogation from certain human rights under the ICCPR, including freedom of movement. The travel ban and its impact on freedom of movement has been considered by the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, I'll call the OHCHR, and that office has noted that neither the martial law nor the travel ban, as announced following Russia's invasion, provide a clear justification for its application to the majority of the male population of the country. OHCHR reports receiving information indicating that even men who were not covered by the general mobilisation decree were prevented at times from leaving the country. So those are the men who fell into the exemption categories. Further from that, the travel ban was initially applicable only to men and therefore resulted in clear differential treatment on the basis of sex, although it was later extended to also include certain categories of women who can be called up for military duty. The ban's practical application across this whole year has continued to disproportionately affect men, since broader categories of men are subject to mobilisation than women. And the travel ban's impacts on freedom of movement are therefore open to question in terms of discrimination, explicit justification and proportionality. Next slide, please. Another area I've been trying to draw some attention to is the rights of children in this context. And unsurprisingly, children are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion is inflicting violations against children across multiple domains. For example, the right to shelter, the right to be educated, and the right to be free from all forms of violence and abuse. In the specific context of the travel ban, human rights issues arise for children who have been forced to flee their homes. And this is, of course, the experience for a shocking number of Ukrainian children, with the flight from Ukraine representing the greatest humanitarian crisis in Europe following World War II. So in April this year, UNICEF reported that 4.8 million of Ukraine's 7.5 million children had been displaced. Over 3 million of them have fled across Ukraine's national borders, and the others are displaced internally. Due to the departure ban on men aged 18 to 60, the vast majority of children have fled with their mothers, many of whom fear the separation of their families could end up being permanent. The number of separated child refugees without any family support has risen across the year, and that's been termed an escalating child protection crisis. There are significant concerns for the safety of these unaccompanied children. In the absence of family support, they're at heightened risk of threats including homelessness, violence and abuse, sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Next slide, please, Jenna. So Article 23 of the ICCPR obliges states to protect the family as the fundamental group unit of society, and this obligation is intertwined with the prohibition in Article 17 on arbitrary interference with the family. Interference with the family, for example, by forcing separations through Ukraine's travel ban, may be considered arbitrary when it interferes with the best interests of the child. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child confirms that children have the right to legal protection against arbitrary interference with their family life. So I would say that alongside discrimination against men in the context of the travel ban, this is an area of real human rights concern with Ukraine's current practice. Slide 8, please, Jenna. It's important as I wrap up my presentation, I think, to also highlight humanitarian law norms in this context. Human rights law and humanitarian law are distinct but complementary bodies of law, with human rights law operating at all times and humanitarian law operating during conflict. These bodies of law share a fundamental concern with the protection and dignity of human life. It's no secret that war inflicts catastrophic trauma on civilian populations. Recognising the threats facing them, almost 8 million or perhaps even over 8 million Ukrainians have now fled their country since the Russian invasion in February. A fundamental principle in humanitarian law is called distinction between combatants and non-combatants. There's an argument to be made that Ukraine is failing to adequately distinguish between its own civilians and members of its armed forces by making so many men subject to a travel ban that keeps them in harm's way regardless of whether they wish to flee or not. Also, as in human rights law, humanitarian law requires states to take all steps possible to prevent family separation. So again, Ukraine can't be said to be meeting this obligation while the current travel ban is maintained. So to conclude, for my own part, I would say that in failing to do all that it can to prevent harm to its civilians during this conflict, Ukraine is not meeting best practice in humanitarian or human rights terms. Although this doesn't change the fact that Russia is the aggressor state in this conflict, Ukraine can and should do more to set an example of adherence to these principles, because in doing so, not only would it have direct beneficial protection impacts for its civilian population, but it would also bolster Ukraine's own legal efforts to hold Russia to those standards. Thank you.